Welcome to the next Inside Speaker interview. My name is Marvin Däumchen, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Chris Letheby, a member of our scientific advisory board and a philosopher of mind and cognitive science. He works on issues arising from the use of psychedelic drugs in psychiatry and neuroscience. And he's a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Western Australia and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Adelaide. Coincidentally, suitably, his monograph, Philosophy of Psychedelics, Naturalism and Psychiatric Mysticism, is set to come out this year in August. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Martin.
To make a start in our interview, would you like to introduce our audience to your book?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I'll say about the book is it actually has lost the subtitle. So it was going to be called Philosophy of Psychedelics, Naturalism and Psychiatric Mysticism. I've now simplified things and it's just called Philosophy of Psychedelics, which is a somewhat sweeping and grandiose title, but I think it's appropriate because it is, in English at least, the first book-length treatment of sort of academic issues in academic philosophy that arise in relation to psychedelics. And it's organized around one particular issue, and that is to do with the role of mystical experiences or mystical type experiences in psychedelic therapy, and the question whether, in the words of Michael Pollan, psychedelic therapy is simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying. So the book is really focused on this question of, are people changing their beliefs about the nature of reality from psychedelic experiences, and is it a problem if they are? Are the sorts of apparent insights that people get under psychedelics veridical, or are they merely hallucinatory? But in the course of trying to address this question, I do cover a number of other issues as well. So I cover issues in the theory of psychedelic therapy, questions about its causal mechanisms, issues to do with the nature of the self and self-consciousness. So it does cover, a focused but still a reasonably broad range of philosophical issues to do with psychedelics, but all in the service of trying to address this central concern about whether people are kind of being treated by a drug that induces sort of comforting but implausible beliefs about reality.
Wow, that is fascinating. I'm excited for the release, and I can't wait to get my hands on that book. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you. I'm excited for it too, after many, many delays.
Well, I'm sure they're worthwhile. Okay.
I hope so.
Then on to our first question. We usually follow the same pattern of questions, so I would like to start to ask you, Chris, how did you get into psychedelics research? And then possibly, having experienced some of the difficulties particular to this field, why did you decide to stay?
Sure. So, I mean, my path was perhaps the inverse of what a lot of people's path is. So you get a lot of people who, Richard Alpert in particular said he didn't have one whiff of God till he took psychedelics. So a lot of people go from psychedelics to mysticism. But I went the other way. I had a long-standing interest in mysticism and spiritual practices before I ever knew much about psychedelics. And I'd heard, of course, as most people have, of hallucinogens, right? These drugs that supposedly have this central effect of making you see things that are not there. But it was only in my late 20s, as I was finishing off my master's in philosophy of cognitive science, which was on the topic of embodied cognition. And then I was about to start my PhD in philosophy of cognitive science on the topic of mental representation and connectionist networks, that I learned about psychedelics a bit more than the popular stereotype. And it kind of blew my mind to learn that there were these psychoactive substances that reliably seem to induce mystical or religious or transcendent experiences. And even more so when I learned about the history of their use in psychiatry, their apparent therapeutic potential, the wave of research in the 1950s and 60s. I just thought this whole thing was fascinating, and it dovetailed with a lot of my kind of interests around mystical states, interests around the epistemic status of spiritual practices, but also interests in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science. And the second thing that really kind of struck me was how little academic philosophers had to say about psychedelics. So we're going back now to late 2012, early 2013, when I was finishing my master's and starting my PhD. And in recent decades, you know, philosophers of mind and philosophers of psychiatry have been very interested in unusual mental states, you know, usually pathological states, and they've had a lot to say about what we can learn about the mind from studying its kind of alterations and aberrations. And so I thought, well, there's got to be something to learn from looking at psychedelic states. And it's kind of amazing that very few people philosophically have really tried to do it. I mean, there are some honorable exceptions. References to psychedelic states have been a feature of Thomas Metzinger's work for a long time, but there wasn't anyone who obviously had made it their focus in philosophy specifically to see what we should make of these states induced by these drugs and what we could learn from them. So that's how I got into it. And in terms of why I've stayed, perhaps one reason is that I haven't actually encountered the sorts of difficulties that a lot of people do, right? I mean, as a philosopher, I have the luxury that I conduct my research from the armchair. So I'm not giving anybody any drugs. I don't have to apply for huge amounts of funding or get ethics approval to dose people with prohibited substances. So, you know, my research, I guess, is it's faces many fewer obstacles than sort of empirical scientific psychedelic research. So I've continued because it's just a fascinating field, and it's continued to be fascinating. And the further and further I go into it, the more and more questions open up. And of course, in the time, in the 8 years or so since I started researching psychedelics, the psychedelic renaissance, the recent resurgence of research has absolutely taken off, and just the amount that we're learning and the amount of interest that has kind of accrued in it is just incredible. So there hasn't been, the reason why I've stayed is there's been every reason to stay and no reason whatsoever to leave.
Thank you. Yeah, I can wholeheartedly agree. The field is completely taking off. But nevertheless, it must have been a fascinating time for you, and surely still is, to discover there's already been so much inquiry, even though it was limited to specific academic disciplines and more possibly some indigenous traditions, less enveloped in the Western culture, so to speak, in the 20th century, early 20th century. So all that you could have discovered back then already must have fueled your interest in the field so much.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's another part of it, is to realize that, you know, not only do these drugs have this propensity to induce these sometimes transformative experiences that people describe as mystical or spiritual or religious, but the fact that they have this incredibly long history, this history going back at least centuries, possibly millennia, of sort of ritual, religious, ceremonial use. And then, as you say, the fact that there was this vast wave of psychiatric and scientific research in the 1950s and 60s. And, you know, a lot of people have heard of Aldous Huxley, a lot of people have read The Doors of Perception, but there's an absolute treasure trove of research that was produced during that period, and, you know, some of which is not even really sort of fully appreciated today. So one book that, you know, you find that several researchers have heard of and have come across, but some people are just unaware of, is Masters and Houston, The Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, this compendium of phenomenology, of, you know, charting the varieties of experiences that LSD and peyote induced in sort of 200 sessions with psychiatrically healthy subjects. And that's just one book. Of course, there are many others. So yeah, as you say, even back in 2012, 2013, when the current wave of research was far less advanced than it is now, there was still far more to read and far more to get into than I could ever hope to read. Honestly, yeah, there's a lot out there.
Speaking of Masters in Houston, if I remember correctly, I recently came across a book that they published that tried to conceptualize and bring together all the different aspects of psychedelic art, which in itself, again, is a field that has been hardly at all academically explored. So there's so many fascinating fields, angles to address the psychedelic experience and the whole culture around it, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It is one of these fascinating things that, yeah, psychedelics have something to offer to virtually every kind of discipline and mode of inquiry, and vice versa. And yeah, as you say, I mean, aesthetics is one thing. I mean, the psychedelic experience very often is centrally aesthetic. It has these incredibly rich aesthetic elements. And as you say, that's sort of been underexplored, at least academically. I mean, there's another book, actually, fascinating book from, I think, the early 70s by R.A. Durr, this professor of English literature, and it's called Poetic Vision and the Psychedelic Experience. And it's basically this systematic comparison and literary analysis of trip reports and romantic poetry. And the argument is that they both stem from essentially the same kinds of attentional modes and the same ways of sort of imaginatively experiencing and conceptualizing the world. And it's one of these things, you know, I mean, we shouldn't kind of measure by citation alone, but you look up this book from the early 70s on Google Scholar and it's only got this tiny handful of citations, and it's just this incredibly rich and unique kind of take on the psychedelic experience that it seems has kind of not completely vanished without a trace. Again, I know of a few people who are aware of it, but just hasn't gotten nearly the sort of attention and recognition that it deserves.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, there's this whole global subculture that has developed around psychedelics, starting from the counterculture in a way and then being illegalized. And there's so much anecdotal experience, so to speak, all these trip reports. And along with them, you also see popular myths, right? Urban myths, psychedelic myths, misconceptions possibly. I also thought about misconceptions earlier when you mentioned hallucinogens. At Mind, we talk about psychedelics, psychedelic experience. Then we have people on the American West Coast introducing psychoplastogens now as a new term to sort of rebrand. And there's still so much complexity and so little common discourse. And apart from that, we still have a lot of misconceptions. So what would you say is one common misconception that you've encountered about psychedelic research or therapy?
Yeah, well, I mean, two sort of common but quite boring misconceptions, I guess, about psychedelics are, first off, I've really learned when I'm presenting my work to non-psychedelic audiences that I have to actually stress at the start the fact that the term psychedelic denotes a specific class of drugs, because people tend to get a bit conceptually confused and they think that psychedelic substance is just a synonym for psychoactive substance. So this is just one basic form of kind of science communication that is, you know, easy to forget or to not realize that you have to actually do, is to make sure your audience is clear on the fact that when we talk about psychedelics, we are talking about a specific type of drug, not just any drug that affects the mind. Once you've got that, the second misconception is, you know, among people who are aware that psychedelic denotes a specific class of drug that's typically been referred to as hallucinogens, the misconception, of course, is that their definitive effects and their most interesting effects are perceptual. And so you have these stereotypes, of course, of the sort of swirling tie-dye kind of as you say, countercultural aesthetic that became very well known in the 1960s, and kind of psychedelic visuals that have kind of cropped up in music videos and so on ever since then. And so because this is the aspect of the psychedelic experience perhaps that is most readily communicable to those who haven't had it, or for whatever other reason, perhaps also because, you know, perceptual effects do tend to predominate at some of the lower doses, which perhaps are the doses that many people have experienced. But for one reason or another, there is this misconception out there that, psychedelic experiences are primarily about changes to perception. That creates a bit of a barrier, because there is then this mystification as to how these drugs could possibly have any kind of therapeutic or transformative effects, right? I mean, what's transformative about seeing pretty colors and seeing the walls melt? So that's something that you kind of need to correct. And another one, so I'll say, this is the third and final one that I'll say, but this speaks more directly to your question, because this is among people who actually are aware that there is a wave of psychedelic research and there is this therapeutic use. Another misconception I often encounter is that the therapeutic use is all about microdosing, right? So this is something that is a bit frustrating because the practice of microdosing has gotten so much press and it's so popular in Silicon Valley and all these places. And then because there's this idea sort of out there in the culture that, you know, high doses of psychedelics are very risky and dangerous and, you know, can't possibly be any good for you, people seem to put all these things together and just come to this assumption that, oh, the safe therapeutic use must be about microdosing, right? That's what people are doing in the new wave of research that is safe and beneficial and that is distinct from the kind of reckless, irresponsible, high dose experimentation that happened back in the 60s. So that is an assumption that I've run up against from time to time. And so that's something that you have to correct. You have to sort of get people on board with the idea that, no, what's going on in the trials that are showing psychiatric potential is actually medium to high dose. It's kind of the full-blown consciousness altering dose of a psychedelic. So, and of course, you know, and it's frustrating partly because microdosing to date has so little empirical support. I mean, that's starting to change. Better studies are starting to be done, but kind of the moderate to high dose therapeutic use has so much more scientific evidence to date than microdosing does. And so this idea that the therapeutic use must be microdosing is, yeah, it's a bit frustrating, but it's you know, thankfully it's reasonably easily corrected once you realize that that is the assumption that's in operation.
Indeed. Thank you. Identify and rectify.
Indeed.
Let us go right to the next question. You mentioned the 60s. When thinking about the 60s, I obviously the 60s aesthetics are something that have kind of clung until now in the broader in society's perception of the psychedelic sphere and as psychedelic aesthetics. I think that's also something that needs to change in a way. The research field, even the economic field, industry is growing, it's exploding at the moment almost. So much is changing and we're expecting a lot more to even accelerate in the coming years. How would you rate or describe the last 5 years, how they have changed in psychedelic research? And what is your prognosis for the next 5 years?
Yeah, well, the last 5 years have been really interesting, and the next 5 years are going to be even more interesting. So, I mean, if you rewind 5 years to the middle of 2016, I think the first open label study of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression from Imperial had just come out. The two sort of double-blind RCTs of psilocybin in end of life from Johns Hopkins and NYU were still a few months away from being published. And I could still keep up with the literature. This is no longer the case. I mean, the pace of the research has just accelerated beyond all comprehension in the last 5 years. And of course, since 2018, we've had the Michael Pollan effect, as it's now being called. So Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, has brought the research to a much broader audience. And, you know, already in 2016, it was pretty routine actually to get positive, you know, neutral to positive coverage in relatively mainstream and even conservative kind of organs like, you know, Wall Street Journal and Scientific American, Business Insider and things like this. But the level of kind of hype and interest and excitement in media coverage, as well as the pace of research, have both accelerated really dramatically. And I think part of what we're going to see in the next 5 years is the field sort of having to scramble a bit and reckon with how rapidly things have started to move and kind of how, I don't want to quite say out of control, but certainly it seems like the push to implement therapeutic psychedelics and the kind of excitement around this as a potential game changer in psychiatry has started to outpace what the scientific research can actually keep up with. And so we're starting to see recognition of the fact that there are, even though there's a lot of knowledge about these substances going back, you know, as you say, in indigenous contexts for at least for centuries, and in a scientific context going back many, many decades, we're starting just now to reckon with the fact that there are still fundamental questions that haven't really been resolved, right? So there are these methodological issues to do with blinding and placebo control? How do you actually convincingly demonstrate efficacy of these treatments in a way that is going to convince people who are skeptical using the standards of evidence that we kind of are accustomed to in psychiatry and pharmacology? Assuming there is a real effect, what exactly is the mechanism? How do you implement this at large scale responsibly? And of course, there's a cluster of issues that are very close to my heart about how should we regard the epistemic status of these experiences? What should we think about belief changes that sometimes seem to be involved? What's the best way to navigate all of that very tricky terrain? A lot of these issues have sort of been discussed to an extent, but haven't really been resolved in any sort of convincing or satisfactory way. And I think one of the things that's going to happen in the next 5 years is we're already starting to see people realize that, look, if these substances are close to, medical use outside of the clinical trial context, the research context, we at least need some pragmatic, fairly solid working answers to these questions, and ideally some well-justified answers. So I think that's going to be one of the real kind of themes, one of the real challenges in the near future, is trying to actually resolve some of these fundamental unresolved issues and answer some of these basic questions.
Right. And it's not just psychiatry and clinical science that can answer these questions. So thank you for being in the field and providing answers from a philosophical perspective.
My absolute pleasure. I hope I've got something to contribute, and I have been very encouraged. I mean, philosophers collaborating across disciplines with academics in other fields, including scientists, has become reasonably commonplace in the last sort of 15 or 20 years, but I've still been extremely heartened by how interested people are and how open and receptive they are to a philosophical perspective, and to the idea that, philosophy might be able to make a substantive contribution to the field itself and to the research, rather than sort of merely sitting back and commenting on the field, actually kind of being an active participant. I've been really, as I say, encouraged and heartened by how many people seem to be of that view. So, yeah.
Yeah, I am personally very interested in your talk. I will definitely attend the Insight talk on the causal relevance on psychedelic experience and to therapeutic effects. And I'm wondering, what is another aspect of our conference that stood out to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there are two things, right? One is I'm really interested in the relations between psychedelics on the one hand and meditation and mindfulness on the other, both from a theoretical and a practical perspective. How can we understand each of these interventions by comparing and contrasting it with the other, and how can we come to a better understanding of cognitive processes of the self-representation and attention by comparative and contrastive analyses of these two sorts of practices. And then from a more practical perspective, right, the idea that judicious, careful psychedelic use might be able to augment meditation training, and the kind of meditation and mindfulness practices might be really useful for psychedelic preparation and integration. So I'm really interested in all those sorts of issues, and there are some talks, some presentations about that I'm very interested in seeing. And the other one just goes to what I was talking about before with the near future of the field, right? I think more and more people are starting to talk about these issues. What should we do about, the fact that we still haven't definitively established whether there's a real therapeutic effect, the fact that we still haven't definitively established, if so, what the mechanism is. What should we do about all the ethical issues, the issues about belief change, the epistemological issues? There are a few different kind of presentations that from one angle or another are looking at some of these things, philosophical issues, clinical issues, ethical issues surrounding belief change, surrounding epistemology, and surrounding kind of fundamental unresolved theoretical questions. And so I'm really interested to see what people have to say about all that.
Yeah, me too. And I hope we can address enough questions for everybody to walk away inspired and enthused for the next event.
I have no doubt that will be the case.
Very good. Chris, thank you for this interview. Thank you for your time and sharing your insights. I'm excited for your participation and to meet you again at Insight this year.
Thanks, Marvin. Likewise.